Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Great job. 15 days to go, November the 5th, the day America goes to the election. And I think we're all waiting with bated breath for the outcome.
I think you'll have to wait longer than that night, though.
I think obviously the consequences are going to be extremely important for the many difficult situations we have in the world. And our topic this morning is the upcoming US election, geopolitics and foreign policy. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to discuss this topic with such a very eminent panel. Kevin, if I could start with you, please. It was terrific to learn many of your insights just now. The results of the election are too close to call. Firstly, the big picture, if I could. A friend of mine recently said, I really hope Trump doesn't win. It's going to be an isolationist administration staffed with unqualified loyalists, determined to abandon allies, start trade wars, and sell Ukraine down the road. In contrast, Harris will be essentially more of the same. Could you perhaps comment on this slightly scary analysis?
Okay. The uniqueness of when you say that about President Trump, you have an administration to judge what happened during that time. We actually had more American troops in Europe. Trump delivery may not have made people happy in Europe, but was he wrong about they should follow through and put 2% of their GDP into their military background? I think he was right. They said he would create war with North Korea when he called them Rocket Man. I saw the love letters. I think it was a different relationship. Could he get along when it became North Korea start testing? I think it was a different relationship with China. I'm concerned about the build they have there together. When you say that he'll back away from Ukraine, I think this is where people get something wrong. When we did our last funding bill in Congress for Ukraine, the president was running for office in a heated part. He never once said no to funding for Ukraine. He came up with a different idea. Make it a loan that could be forgivable by the president. It couldn't all be forgivable under Biden. It could be somewhat forgivable under a Biden administration, but also the next administration. I think the president understands very clearly where this world lies at the same time, but also in this conflict of where we have around the world, sometimes having fresh eyes is a better ability. Sometimes having somebody that already has prior relationships, a better ability. I'm a little more concerned with the vice president having not been in that situation yet. And I had a lot of discussions. I'll give you one discussion I had with President Biden prior to Putin invading. The president called me and he was telling me he had a discussion with Putin and that he really laid out these sanctions and he didn't believe Putin would invade. And I said, Mr. President, I respectfully disagree. In America, we have what is called the Gang of Eight, and I've sit on the Gang of Eight for a number of years. And I said, this is my belief of Putin. Putin is like a mafia boss. He looks at everything in black and white. He's lived under sanctions for more than a decade, and I still think he's one of the wealthiest people in the world. I don't think he has a great over-concern for his own citizens, and it's the 100th anniversary that year of the creation of the Soviet Union. What Putin respects is strength. If we had sent weapons earlier and not people, I don't think that invasion would have taken place. I remember in 2015, having gone to Ukraine after the first invasion, I went then to see Vice President Biden to advocate let's sell Ukraine javelins, the defensive weapons against tanks. And the response I got back that Merkel and others wouldn't want that. So when people say they're worried about Trump, sometimes having a clear, strong, decisive foreign policy, you might not like the delivery, but it's kind of like your mother or father giving you advice. It's pretty good at times. It turns to be true.
Thank you very much. Charles, if I could turn to you, it's wonderful to have you on the panel. You've been tracking the election minute by minute. You were at both of the party congresses, I know. Would you buy into this slightly scary scenario of Trump on the international scene?
Yeah, so first, thank you to Dalma and the AIM Summit for having me back. And Mr. Speaker, I'm a huge admirer of yours, and thank you for your service to the country. Although I totally disagree with you on the outcome of the election. I give Kamala a 65% probability of winning. And it's going to come down to turnout. As you said, we're seeing in the 14 million Americans that have already voted early, women voting at about a 53% ratio to 43% men in the swing states so far. And we'll keep an eye on it. But anyway, I do have huge respect for you. I wanted to address that question. I am not in the camp and have never really bought into the mostly Democratic narrative that Trump is only going to hire weak people, yes people, there will be no guardrails. In fact, every name that the Trump campaign and Trump himself has trial ballooned for Treasury Secretary, for Fed Chair, any major position have been incredibly impressive. Also, as a quick aside, a number of the folks that really want to be Treasury Secretary are auditioning aggressively on TV and out there. But every one of them, Scott Bessent, very good friend of mine, excellent, Howard Lutnick, John Paulson, even Bob Lighthizer, although I think Lighthizer gets commerce. Every one of these names are very impressive. We'd be very happy with in the markets. On the issue of the Fed, and Dan Murphy asked you this, Mr. Speaker, I actually agree with you. Trump's not going to take over the Fed and undermine monetary policy. He's already told us that he's committed to keeping Chair Powell in his seat until his term is up in February 26. Very positive signal to the markets. If Trump wins, last quick point, he will only have the opportunity to appoint 2 FOMC governors over his 4 years, a replacement for Powell at the end of his term and a vice chair along the way. It's still a minority of voters on the FOMC. He's not taking over monetary policy. And very importantly, any appointment, whether it's cabinet or Fed, has to be confirmed in the Senate. I do agree with the Speaker. I think the Senate does go Republican, but it's a much more mature body, with all due respect to your former body, the House. It is a much more moderate body, and they're not going to confirm crazy people if Trump wins. I feel very good about it.
You're 100% correct. And the thing you have to remember, Trump can only serve 1 term. So there's a lot of people who want to be president. So everybody wants to serve in Trump's administration.
Yes.
And our founders did. Look, the Senate is a country club and the House is like eating at a truck stop. We are a microcosm society.
Thank you. Mike, at the Washington Institute, you're working at the highest level of US policy. And some commentators have commented on the Trumpification of US policy. In other words, Harris will keep or possibly increase tariffs. She's grown harsher on immigration. And certainly she's dropped her previous opposition to fracking. In other words, there's not much daylight between the candidates. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here at the AIM Summit and in Dubai. Thanks for having me. Look, I think there is a certain truth to this idea that there's continuity, oftentimes more continuity than we like to admit, between U.S. administrations. Because when it comes to foreign policy, the United States, in our sort of desired role as a global leader, is often driven by global events. We don't have the luxury that some other countries do of picking and choosing exactly where we're going to engage and saying, okay, we're going to ignore this major event because it has nothing to do with us. Well, we think everything has to do with us in the United States. And so the idea of saying, well, let's ignore what's happening in the Middle East or let's ignore what's happening in Europe, you'll hear voices urge those things in Washington, but it rarely actually happens because that's not how we see ourselves in the United States. And I think, frankly, that's a good thing. I think the world with the U.S. as a leader is a better world than the world without the United States as a leader. So it's true. When you look at China, for example, which is our most pressing foreign policy challenge, President Trump imposed tariffs on China. But at the same time, he tried to engage constructively with China. You remember his visit to the Forbidden City with Xi Jinping. He was criticized in many quarters for that. But then if you look at President Biden not only kept President Trump's tariffs on things like steel and aluminum, he added to his tariffs for somewhat different causes, different reasons, different policy areas, for example, like climate, but ultimately towards the same end. Not just to sort of reinvigorate American industry, but also for national security reasons. And he also tried to, just like President Trump, engage constructively with Xi Jinping. You'll remember their meeting where President Biden came out and said this was the most constructive meeting we've had that I can remember. So you'll see these commonalities because there is, I would say, an impetus in Washington to take this challenge seriously, but as Speaker McCarthy said, to also avoid conflict and war. That's what Americans want. Americans want us to be tough and successful versus our adversaries, but also not be drawn into conflict with those adversaries. And so this is something they face in common. I will say, though, just to maybe get back to the very first question you asked to Speaker McCarthy, you also see our parties, unfortunately, often ignoring the same challenges. And that's something we have to be very careful of. I'm worried, for example, that with all these challenges in the world, our military spending is not where it needs to be. We're not positioned to actually address challenges in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe simultaneously. We're not coping with the question of our debt at the same time. So while we're not spending enough on the military, we're also not coping with our debt. So it's almost like the worst of both worlds, in a sense. I think that the next president who comes along, you asked about isolationism, is going to have a real challenge, potentially, maintaining American global leadership unless they're willing to confront those challenges. You know, the challenge of China may come to a head in the next administration, whether it's President Harris or whether it's President Trump. We won't get to choose that. It doesn't depend necessarily on who gets elected in our election. Whether they can do that while maintaining the commitment you see today to the Middle East, where we've been surging American forces in order to try to head off conflict, while they continue to also support Ukraine to fend off what have been significant Russian advances there. That will be very challenging without a real increase in the resources we're putting against these problems.
Well, thank you very much. That's very relevant, and it actually brings me on to the particular specific topic, and we'll go through several that I'd like to discuss now. With you, Mike, perhaps you could kick this off. You were Senior Director for the Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. We have a very troubled landscape here in the moment, particularly dramatic events last week. How would you contrast the likely Middle East policies of Harris and Trump? And frankly, what advice would you give?
Well, look, I think the first thing I would say is I think the U.S. is going to remain committed to the Middle East. You know, I know there's a lot of worries in this region, and there have been for years now, about a U.S. withdrawal. I think you can see now that the U.S. withdrawal is not happening, that the U.S. commitment remains there. Sometimes it's a reluctant commitment. We don't always do the right thing, frankly. But I think that commitment is real. And I think you saw that both from President Trump, who had a great success, frankly, with the Abraham Accords, a success that I think is also attributable to the leadership here in the UAE, maybe first and foremost, because of the courage that it took. But I think we've also seen under President Biden, to give him full credit, a willingness to back up our allies when the chips are down during this current conflict. We've seen American aircraft carriers. We just saw the use of B-2 bombers against the Houthis in Yemen for the first time they've been used in combat since 2017. And that sends a message to our adversaries. So you've seen an American commitment to the Middle East. I think the question is, how are we going to make this commitment successful and sustainable over time? And I think what that will require of the next president is to try to move away from this sort of all-encompassing conflict we see now. I think it's clear that this isn't sustainable. This has to be brought to conclusion. It has to be brought to a conclusion in a way that those who are, sponsors of terror, those who are sponsors of regional chaos, pay a price, that a serious cost is imposed on them, that they're deterred. But then we have to get back to, I think, a positive agenda for the region. And I think that positive agenda for the region is building upon those Abraham Accords, is building upon the links within the region so that you have more intra-regional trade, so that you have more security cooperation within the region. And so I think from the U.S. perspective, the sort of holy grail, as it were, so that you have more regional solutions to problems within the region. So you have actors like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others stepping up into leadership roles, with the U.S. in a more supporting role, not absent, not withdrawing, but supporting the initiatives that are brought forward by our partners in the region. I think the next president will want to do that, regardless of who they are, and that's what they should do.
Thank you very much. Speaker McCarthy, could I just also refer pretty well the same question to you? I mean, we've got this tremendous dilemma between the Iranian factions, if you like, and the enormous humanitarian needs at the moment. Do you see that there would be any difference between the two potential candidates on how this very pressing issue might be solved?
I think there'll be differences, but I do think America tries to speak with one. But I want to play on what you said, because we are sitting here, and I think UAE deserves a lot of credit simply from the leadership of where they took. I remember being in the White House with the Abraham Accords and Ambassador Yusuf sitting there. I mean, that was a risk at the time, but it was for, I think you picked up a very good point that I think from America's point of view, on some things we may have made a misstep on and some things around the world, America can do more than one thing at a time, and people think we're just going to pivot towards Asia. It doesn't mean you ignore the Middle East, but it also means that in the Middle East, a lot of people are doing things in their own region and their own leadership. We should support that more and not be viewed like we're being vacant. It also, from a perspective, from an American point of view, if you think we're going to step out of the Middle East, what happens then? We're back here in a bigger place militarily than we have been before. That's taking a lot of our military at a time when we'd probably be placing other ways. So you have to be here. But I think the clear decision is you should embrace your allies so they never question. And I think sometimes when we change leadership, being contentious, we misjudge on our words and our actions worldwide instead of leaving the differences in America. And look, we had a very close election last time, and it kind of felt with the new administration that if Trump did anything, they had to do the opposite. And that's something we need to learn in America that we cannot do to our friends and allies around the world, so that there should be no doubt and no question. And I think that's a lesson we learned pretty well going through, and from administrations, I feel that we'll be able to
Thank you very much.
make that correction.
Thank you indeed. Charles, if I could turn to you, and it was a topic that was significantly mentioned in the last session with Speaker McCarthy. And I'd like to just raise the matter of China. Both candidates, I think, say that China is basically stealing intellectual property. It is obviously distorting the global economy with unfairly subsidized goods. But both would maintain the one China strategic ambiguity and would be prepared to protect Taiwan if invaded. Could you talk around that characterization and perhaps tell us how you feel that both candidates might differ on that?
Yeah, I think on U.S.-China, in a way, it almost doesn't matter who wins our election, because the direction of travel in the bilateral is net negative, right? The four main of many sources of tension, but the four main sources only get worse. The trade war, the tech export restriction list. We're going to add more technologies and convince more of our allies to join that. Third, we're subsidizing some of the supply chain diversification with the CHIPS Act and the IRA. And lastly, Taiwan. Each of these issues only become bigger sources of tension in the bilateral. So, you know, I just came back from Asia, and it's really interesting. In every meeting I would go to, and I meet mostly with the buy side, the consensus was Trump would be much better for U.S.-China. And the logic is that he's transactional, he's going to want to cut deals, engage with President Xi, somehow de-escalate the trade war. And while I agree with the first part of that assessment, he is clearly transactional and will, I'm sure, hold a summit with President Xi, as he did with Leader Kim. President Trump likes the pageantry of acting like a president or being president. The truth is, very little will come out of it, I believe. And by the way, on the engagement with North Korea, yes, we temporarily stopped him from testing, but today North Korea is much further along in the development of their nuclear military capability, in part, I think, because we almost enabled him. So I do worry about that. Having said that, on China, the truth is, any notion that Trump is somehow going to be softer on China is just a misread of him. You know, as a quick reminder, he started the trade war. Yes, Biden has taken it further, and whoever wins will take it a bit further. President Trump started the tech containment of China with Huawei. People forget that often. And at the end of the day, he wants to put even higher tariffs on China to accelerate the decoupling U.S.-China. The only slight distinction with Harris is she'll keep the trade war going as well, but she wants to use export controls more and expand the tech export restriction list to further de-risk from China. It's a subtle difference, but the truth is, as Americans, we all agree that China is our biggest national security threat, and there's very little daylight between the two parties, and I think even in a way the two presidents. There will be a difference in approach, but not certainly in the end game, which is to ensure the United States not only has the bigger economy, but that we are the world leader in tech and the dominant military superpower, and China is not. And by the way, as a quick aside, Mr. Speaker, I think that the China Select Committee that you set up, as you said, was not only bipartisan, actually one of the most effective committees that Congress, that the House has had in years, and I really hope it continues into the new Congress, by the way. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much, Charles. Mr. Speaker, if I could go to you with a really very big picture question. I think the rise of China to great power status has probably been a defining issue in previous decades, and the US's ability to transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world is of critical importance. You've mentioned Thucydides' trap. How do you envisage that, and how do you envisage this developing over the coming decade?
If I could just build on what he said too, a lot of that's correct, but there's one difference is China's a different China than they were 4 years ago. President Xi Jinping is in a different situation, not economically as strong as he was, knowing the challenge. You also have the rise of India. Don't mistake Trump's relationship with Modi. Also, in studying of history, when we started the 3 communiques with China, part of the discussion with Kissinger was the Soviet Union. You can use and see some of that too, the build of where China versus India, America being the oldest democracy, India being the largest. They didn't have a one-child policy. The peaking of China's demographics, the economic challenges there too. I think Xi Jinping is going to want to get into the Oval Office as quick as they can. And the whole discussion about America and China, don't view it as a one-party issue. It is a unifying issue between Republicans and Democrats and has only gotten stronger. And if I can credit President Trump for one place, there's certain things that he has always fundamentally believed, whether you agree with him or not. And about China and WTO, that's where he's always been, and the rest of the country kind of caught up to him. So I think you'll see that regardless of where, I just think you'll have a stronger position from a President Trump there, knowing the policies before. But the world is different. The world's moving rapidly. There's one thing else I did in Congress. Look, I look at things in a 30,000-foot level, micro and macro, and I put them in that perspective. MIT would teach a course to all the generals in the American military on AI and quantum. Whoever captures that, I think, has an advantage, as the rest of the world knows. So I went to MIT like 3 years before I became speaker. I took 10 members, and I had them develop a course for members of Congress. And if I look from a world perspective, UAE is doing a tremendous job with AI. China seems, under Xi Jinping, he's never going to allow it enough freedom in fear that it would do something in the electoral world that would change. Europe's going to overregulate it, and America could be the Wild West. I think it brings that back to the West Coast to see what's driven. So how we do that from a policy-wise and an economic, and the one thing I do think that happened with COVID in China, the allies, I think, have woken up and realized the dependency that we all have within China, and that's a weakness. And I think now we rely on each other a little more, and I think that push can drive. And the world is different now that you have China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran bound together. I think that drives other people who may have had relationships but didn't feel the need to be as close, that I think from a world that believes in freedom will drive even further that axis of evil has to be broken. That cannot grow, otherwise the world will not be safe.
Right. Thank you very much. Mike, I'd like to turn to you, if I may, on the very important issue of Ukraine. Here we do seem to have significant differences. Harris she said she will back Ukraine as long as it takes to counter the threat, and Trump has stated that he will get the war over very quickly. To what extent do you think either of these are slightly political posturing, or how do you see the situation developing after inauguration?
So, I'm going to start by referring back to the last question because I think that it's relevant here as well. I personally don't believe in a Thucydides trap. One author said that Thucydides is like Harry Potter for foreign policy scholars. And I think the problem with the Thucydides trap idea for the U.S. and China is first, and I think this may be a little bit controversial, but I view the United States as the rising power and China as the decaying power. And I think there are other rising powers in the world. I think we are sitting in one of them.
Multipolar.
Saudi Arabia is another. India is another. Japan is another. I think there are actually several rising powers. And the real risk, I think, for a country like China, which is slowing down economically, which is in demographic decline, which is not a free country, is that it will lash out as it stagnates. And it might not lash out against the United States. One of the problems in talking about U.S.-China competition endlessly, because it's an important topic, don't get me wrong, is that we start to talk about the world as though it's a sort of binary competition between the U.S. and China, as though we're in a new Cold War. We're not. There are many rising powers in the world that are competing and will compete with China. India is one of them, as Speaker McCarthy mentioned. But I believe the United States is a rising power. We're a center of population growth, of innovation, of economic growth, and so forth. And it's important that we think of ourselves that way in the United States. It frustrates me when we sort of so easily talk about ourselves as a declining power. We're not. Russia is a declining power. Russia is a power in a state of advanced decline. And I think that's why you see it doing what it is doing, lashing out in Ukraine, but not only Ukraine. Look at what's happening in Moldova right now.
Yes.
Georgia, in Belarus, which is essentially captive to Russia. The next president is going to have a real problem with this in the way that the current president does. And I have to be honest, I'm not sure I have seen anyone's plan that looks to me as though it's a solution for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The reality is that Russia is paying an enormous price for every inch that it moves forward in Ukraine. But Russia is a country with enormous resources, and Ukraine is much smaller. And so I think that, we're going to have to develop a strategy for Ukraine that is a strategy for the long haul, to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and to help it avoid further territorial encroachment by the Russians. And that's going to be very challenging for the next president. I think that the idea of negotiating a quick deal, I understand the logic behind it. The logic is, I think, that President Trump has, which is not faulty logic, is that if you can somehow sort of use incentives and disincentives to make President Putin, for example, feel as though continuing the conflict is worse for him than reaching a deal, that's fine. I think the problem is that if we withdrew our support from Ukraine, that would be devastating for the Ukrainians.
Right.
If we significantly increase our support for the Ukrainians, it's not clear to me that that's devastating for the Russians, given the tools at our disposal, given what can be realistically accomplished on the battlefield. And so I think that the next president is going to find themselves having to, again, sort of think about a long-term strategy for supporting Ukraine. I think we in the United States will actually step forward under either a Harris or Trump administration to support Ukrainian sovereignty for the long haul. I think a lot of what you're seeing now has more to do with sort of the moment that we're in politically than it does with a sort of real long-term strategy. But I think we have to be absolutely clear. There is another long-term problem here. It's not just Russia's decline. It's not just what Russia is doing. It's that our European allies, and President Trump identified this, but frankly, he was building on the frustrations of his predecessors going back to Dwight Eisenhower. Europe has allowed its own capabilities. Europe is a wealthy, wealthy place. It's allowed its military capabilities to deteriorate to basically nil. Look at what Europe is doing in this region, escorting ships through the Red Sea. The problem is that these ships can't actually defend against anything because they don't have the capabilities. Europeans long ago really stopped even trying. to have military capabilities suitable to addressing the types of threats posed by even the Houthis in Yemen. That is a long-term problem as well. We cannot do everything in the United States. We can't ask our population to take up every burden and to shoulder every problem in the world. Our partners and our friends have to step up as well.
And if I could reemphasize one thing too, so everybody understands. The support for Ukraine inside the House, very bipartisan. More than 300 votes, even on the last one. And that's during politics of it. I think the one lesson that the world needs to learn about Ukraine is don't put yourself in a position for something like Ukraine to happen again. So if you're worried about Taiwan, you supply them the weapons so no one thinks it's easy to invade. I think a misstep in Afghanistan, what President Biden made, gave Putin a misstep. I think when he went to meet with him and he lifted the sanctions off Nord Stream 2, gave a wrong discussion. But you're right, there's all these merging countries. But it's also, when you fight a war in Ukraine, where this administration would limit, if you tell Ukraine they can have a missile, but you can only send it 40 miles, Russia moves their troops back 41. It's hard to win a war like that. And if you study what President Trump did coming into office, that we had a challenge with a rise in the Middle East, he used weapons we hadn't used before and curved an uprising. So I think a new eye and a new approach may bring the negotiations closer to the table, because I think he won't be afraid to do what it needs to be done.
Could I just pick up Speaker McCarthy on one point in connection with what you just said? In other words, the role of NATO. I mean, Putin, one of the ideas he's been promulgating is that NATO was becoming a danger for Ukraine. That's why he had to invade. Trump has quite implied, certainly, that he would not particularly support NATO. Some people say he might even pull out of NATO. Could you talk about a little bit the
I don't see him pulling out of NATO. I don't see him pulling out of NATO. I think President Trump's frustration is, if you're in Europe and you're in NATO and you pledge every time that you're going to spend 2% of your GDP for a military, but you never do it, and you expect America taxpayers to spend the money and do it, no longer going to do it. Something that President Trump did too, to our allies who would request, we have an uprising, can you send American troops in? Yes, we will, but you need to pay for it too. It can't just be on our back. That's the difference that people have to look to and think about President Trump, of where he looks for a business. We've got a debt problem too. We want to help you and we will help you. What the world has to look at too is the next war is going to start in space. If you learned anything about drones, it's everybody prepares for the war they already fought. We need to use Silicon Valley to reform our Pentagon, because you can't be spending $1 million missile to shoot out a $10 drone. And we look at the ability of the drones. And you look at AI today, an AI pilot flies better than a human pilot because they can take 9 Gs, 10 Gs. You don't have to have all the apparatus. So it's what country can overwhelm the next one. And no one's going to be able to do that by themselves, but all these merging economies and countries that have a relationship about freedom, I think that bounds together changes the dynamics of a person like Putin. And I again say, if you study World War II, if you study Adolf Hitler, he did the exact same things that Putin has done. And I don't believe that's very clear between right and wrong. And I believe America will always stand on the right side, regardless how politically tough it is in that situation.
Thank you very much.
Can I weigh in on
Charles,
Ukraine just quickly? Look, I think that I agree that the United States is not going to abandon Ukraine, and at the end of this war, and all wars end, there will be a free and independent Ukraine. It's just going to be smaller. The issue I have with President Trump's approach is he wants to end the war before he's inaugurated, which is obviously not going to happen. But the only way to get this war to end is to do a couple things, and he's already said he'll do this. One, threaten to cut off economic and military aid to Ukraine to get them to the table. And I think the only incentive really, or two incentives to get Russia to the table, because by the way, Russia's winning the war, just objectively, is they're going to get 20% of Ukraine, but I think sanctions relief for Russia is going to have to be on the table under Trump. I think he would be open to that. Financial services, commercial aviation, possibly the oil price cap. If Harris wins, the difference is the war takes much longer, drags well into next year, and sanctions stay on Russia as long as Putin's in power. And it brings me to Taiwan. President Trump was dead against this most recent aid package for Ukraine, and it also had money in there for Taiwan and Israel, but it was the Ukraine piece that he's against. I understand his logic. What worries me on that, though, is will President Trump step up if he's president, and will the United States defend Taiwan if China is serious in their ambition to take Taiwan by force or other, maritime blockade, et cetera? I think that's a question mark. The risk of being an isolationist, the United States president doesn't have the luxury of being an isolationist. Trump's overall philosophy of America first makes sense, but in foreign policy, the United States has to lead. We have to be out there front and center. And I really hope if he wins, we will defend Taiwan militarily. It will be absolutely critical to our national interest, not to mention our allies in the Indo-Pacific.
The only thing I'd like to remind everybody, Putin has invaded another country through every president that he's been in power, except one, the one that believed in America first. Same thing, Reagan said, America first. That doesn't mean we ignore the world. That means we have a responsibility in the world. And I think people misunderstand part of that logic.
Thank you very much. Well, we have run out of time. I think that's a wonderful way of concluding our discussion. I have got just one more question that actually two of you have answered. Who is going to win the election?
Kamala Harris, 65% probability.
Look, I think because it's electoral college, when Biden won, he had a 10% favorability. Hillary Clinton had better poll numbers 8 years ago as today. Joe Biden was about 8 points higher than where Kamala Harris was today. I think the momentum has shifted. If you would have asked me 3 weeks ago, I would have given Kamala a little better position than she is today. But like I said, I think it's 60% Trump. I think the Senate, the Republicans probably get to 52. That's not a big difference between 52 and 59, because 60 is the magic number. And whoever wins the House is only going to really have it by like a 5 to 6 seat majority.
I had one thing, though.
Yeah, please,
the key difference with 2020 and 16, because Speaker McCarthy's right on the difference of where Harris is versus Biden and Hillary Clinton before that. The key difference has been the Supreme Court decision on women's reproductive rights. You know, the polling showed a Republican sweep of Congress in the midterms in November of 2022. The Democrats massively outperformed. And you know, I think that what a lot of people are really underestimating is how strongly women feel about this issue, and men like me who care. So I think that in the end, it is a turnout election. We'll see what happens. I've competed against your party. You guys are a formidable opponent, a great opponent. You were much better before Trump took your party over. You guys have Stockholm Syndrome. Literally, the worst example of Stockholm Syndrome I've ever seen in my life. You love your abuser. He got you voted out of the House, Mr. Speaker, with Matt Gaetz, and you still support him. But we'll move on from that. If Harris wins, I think the party, hopefully your party, moves to purge him.
Hold on, one thing. Everyone who cares about data, the 2020 election was during COVID. So election laws were different than they are today, where everybody was mailed a ballot. In Pennsylvania, everybody was mailed a ballot. It's not that way today. In Pennsylvania, there were 400,000 Democrats who voted in that election who've never voted since. And if you look at the voter registration, Democrat has gone down, Republicans gone up. So
Mike,
we'll bet lunch at the end to see who's...
We'll know in 15 days.
I'm just going to ask for Mike's insights into this discussion.
You know, I just took my 18-year-old son to vote for the very first time in his life. And I just feel always happy and blessed to live in a country where we can do that. In democracy, we all win.
There you go. Thank you very much. A big hand for our panelists. Thank you.